I would like to call Prof. Felix Dakora to the stage. And Margot, is she ready? Apologies, but thank you very, very much for being so persistent in joining us in this session this afternoon. We've just had a plenary on science diplomacy, but my three Jacks and a Jill are going to do justice to this topic for science diplomacy for social justice. So we'll just wait for everybody to be mic'd up, and then we will get going. So I'm sure you already have been sensitized to the topic, and you have some thoughts of your own, some questions that you would like to fire to our new panelists. So please be active in the discussion session. So while we wait for Prof. Dakora to get his audio mic'd up, I will just introduce him in the meantime. So our speakers today are going to include Professor Felix Dakora, and he's from the African Academy of Science. When you see him, you'll realize he has been on the stage a couple of times. He's the one who punted some advocacy questions to our president. And then we're going to have Mr. Alex Reog, and he's the CEO of Science Tech DiploHub and the Barcelona Chief Science and Tech Envoy. He's on my far right. And I hadn't realized, but we had met previously, albeit virtually, so welcome. And then we're going to have Dr. Marga Gos Sola, and she's the head of science diplomacy, capacity building at Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. There's Margot, all dressed for tonight's dinner. And then we have Dr. Jan Marker Muller, who is a coordinator for science diplomacy and multilateral relations at the European Commission. And he's the one with the smart bow tie. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a session that is a partnership by the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa and with the DiploHub, etc. And I am very privileged to be the moderator here this afternoon. My name is Himla Sudial, and I'm the Executive Officer at the Academy of Science of South Africa. And up front, I just want to give tribute and thanks to Carol O'Brien, who's been working tirelessly behind the scene to put together the panel and the program. So we've heard about science for diplomacy and diplomacy in science. We've heard about the complexities of the issues, but seated here are some of the stalwarts who provide that background of training and introduction into what is science diplomacy and how it is utilized. But I would allow them to lead us into the discussion as to how they come to the party and bring their creativity to us all. But before we start, I'd like to now call on Prof. Felix Dakora to give us an African perspective on science diplomacy. Felix.
Thank you very much, Madam Program Director. Yeah, it gives me great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. And indeed, what I'm going to talk about is more around what the African Academy of Sciences has been trying to do using science diplomacy to train the future generation of scientists for the African continent. So the title is An African Perspective on Science, Diplomacy, Footprint of the African Academy of Sciences. And basically, just before I can go into detail, it's important to remind people that the African Academy of Sciences is a Pan-African organization. It covers all the 55 member states of the African Union. And as such, it has got the responsibility, in addition to national academies has got a responsibility to do business with the African Union to ensure that we train the future generation of scientists for the continent. What's also important is that it recognizes all knowledge domains, from natural sciences, humanities, social sciences, health, to agricultural, nutritional sciences, mathematical sciences, policy sciences. It offers it has a think tank function and offers science advice to the African Union at critical times. And one of its main ally or stakeholder is actually the Commissioner for Education, Science and Innovation, Science, Technology and Innovation at the African Union. So it's therefore got a lot of convening power and a lot of responsibility for science diplomacy within the continent. In terms of science diplomacy and to expand our operations, we recently, this year in June, resolved to set up regional offices of the African Academy of Sciences in Asia, Europe, and in North America. And this is to allow growth of the academy and to also give it visibility as well as find new allies that we can collaborate with. In the case of Asia, the Chinese embassy in Pretoria has been extremely helpful, and together with our Chinese fellows of the African Academy of Sciences, they've helped us to get a place in Beijing. So Beijing will be the regional office for Asia, and in the case of Europe, Edinburgh has been identified as the potential host of the office of the African Academy of Sciences. We are in discussion with some colleagues who are fellows from the USA, and so it's very likely that the USA will also be the host to the office, the North American office of the African Academy of Sciences. This is the footprint of the academy outside Africa. The AAS is working closely with a number of academies in the world, which include the US National Academy of Sciences, Chinese Academy of Sciences, Chinese Academy of Engineering, Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, the Royal Society in the UK, and also the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In fact, they sent a strong four-member delegation to our recent AGM here. They left only yesterday back to Edinburgh, and also we are working with the joint NASEM, that is the US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. In addition to these academies, we also have MOUs and collaborations with individual universities, and these are some of them. The University of Edinburgh, we have an MOU with them with some potential projects, which I'll show you in a while. Tsinghua University in Beijing, the China Agricultural University also in Beijing, Hebei Agricultural University, Hebei University, and Nanjing Tech University. We've had discussions with all of these institutions. During the lockdown in particular, we had many virtual meetings and workshops, all in the name of expanding our wings in terms of collaboration and cooperation. Now, the ultimate aim of, you might have seen a number of Chinese academies as well as Chinese universities that we've signed MOUs with. The ultimate aim of the AAS-China partnership is to establish the China-Africa Agricultural Science, Technology and Innovation Alliance, otherwise called CASTIA. And the rationale behind it is fairly simple. The situation in China is much more closer to Africa in that until recently, China was still struggling to feed its population, and that's where they've gone out of it. They've got zero hunger in China. Africa is still struggling to feed itself. Secondly, China has 9% of the agricultural landmass in the world, and is able to produce 20% of the world's food. In contrast, Africa has about 64% of the agricultural landmass and can produce only 10% of the food that it eats. So most of the food eaten in Africa is actually imported. So it's important that the African Academy of Sciences picks up systems that are similar. We also try to do something similar with India, but that is still in the operational stage. So the initiative, this CASTIA initiative actually was started by the agricultural, will involve the agricultural universities in Africa and China, agricultural research councils and institutes in Africa and China, as well as agribusiness and agri-entrepreneurs in both China and Africa. And of course, the ultimate people who farm in Africa are women and youth, and so they will be a major component of this initiative. With regards to the with regards to the AAS Edinburgh Partnership, which I just mentioned recently, the AAS and the Royal Society of Edinburgh have done an MOU, and although there will be some programs that we will share with each other, the most important thing for the AAS is for the Royal Society of Edinburgh to assist us in recruiting more women and social scientists into the academy. They are very good at that. They've got many social scientists, they've got many women scientists. We are struggling to fulfill those obligations. And with this MOU, I'm sure they will be able to help us do that. Also, the AAS has signed an MOU with the University of Edinburgh, and they established a visiting fellowships program targeting the AAS affiliates. These are young emerging scientists that join the academy at a different level altogether in the hope that they will grow to become fellows of the academy. Now, in May 2023, next year, we're going to have a meeting with the University of Edinburgh in Nairobi, and this will be to tease out just what we want to do. The University of Edinburgh is coming to the table with many ideas, some of which include questions like what can Edinburgh, in this case University of Edinburgh, do to support research and teaching in Africa? Should the focus be on early career researchers? Should there be fellowships, programs? Should there be scholarships, awarded to students in Africa by the African Academy of Sciences? We have not yet had that meeting, but when we do have it, we'll tease out what we want to do, and we'll take that process forward. Now, with regards to the African Academy of Sciences, U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, otherwise called NASEM partnership, that has actually led to some success stories. In November this year, we had what was known as the first U.S. Africa Frontiers of Science, Engineering and Medicine Symposium that took place from 12th to 14th October in Nairobi. And believe me or not, we received over 900 applications. And of these, only 50 were selected from Africa, and 50 were selected from the USA to attend this symposium in Nairobi. Now, the disciplinary areas that were covered by the symposium include artificial intelligence, biodiversity, climate change and food security, infectious diseases, and material science. I can assure you that this first symposium was so successful that the funders resolved that they will finance another one next year, and in a different regional office of the African Union, and in this case, the West Africans, Ghanaians, and Nigerians were already putting up their hands to be able to host it. So these are some of the partnerships that we have that are extremely fruitful and are leading to rapid training of or skilling of our young academics. We also have another collaboration with the European Union Commission and the African Union Commission, and that has led to the allocation of some 30 million euros towards training early career scientists for the continent. And indeed, this is one of the best programs that I think I have seen in my lifetime within the academy. Each successful applicant received 500,000 euros per grant for 5 years. In other words, it's 100,000 euros per year for 5 years. And I tell the young scientists they are lucky. My time, there was nothing like that. And with 100,000 euros per year for 5 years, I think it has very high potential to propel a lot of them into leadership within the science environment. So this was just a press release when we held a meeting in Nairobi for that. I'm sure some people who were there might be in the audience, but somebody like Professor Jean-Pierre Bossignon, who I saw this afternoon, is dark from here. I can't see if he's here. But he is one of those that was instrumental when he was president of the European Research Council. It's through his initiative and his support that we are able to get this. And he's very happy because he's seeing the ARISE participants, some of them are sitting here, and they came to the AGM of the AAS, they made presentations, and I can assure you they are doing some fabulous, fantastic science. I enjoy listening to them present. So this is another initiative which is working out for the continent, undertaken by the AAS on behalf of the European Union and the African Union. We also decided to undertake other activities, and well, many of you are aware of the tensions between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan around the construction of the Renaissance Dam. So we took the view that as scientists, we should be able to moderate the situation and find a solution to it. And so we applied for a grant from the inter-academic partnerships. It was a total of 40,000, anything between 30,000 and 40,000 US dollars. Unfortunately, we did not get a grant. But lo and behold, thanks to the Frontiers Foundation, in a recent conversation in Berlin when I was attending Fallen Walls Science Summit, I talked to the colleagues from the Frontiers Foundation, and they have been very kind. They support the idea, they think it's wonderful, and so they have given the AAS 40,000, which we are going to use to convene a conference of scientists from Ethiopia, from Egypt, and from Sudan, where they can all make presentations around the benefits of the Nile water to the citizens of each of those three countries. And hopefully at the end of it, the AAS with some qualified and experienced people will moderate how we go forward with this agenda. Scientists don't have to fight among themselves. They just love meeting each other and presenting scientific work for criticism and to improve that. So we think using this approach has very high chance of succeeding, other than the political mediation, whether it's by America or whether it is by the African Union or even by the United Nations. This matter has gone to all the three. It's gone to the UN, it's gone to America, it's gone to the AU, and there's still no resolution. Now, we think by meeting and doing that, we can find common methodology to undertake research that will provide empirical evidence why Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan are complaining, or why Ethiopia doesn't have to really worry too much, because if the modeling studies show that indeed there is no negative effect of the Renaissance Dam on the water on the other side of the river that's being used by Sudan and by Egypt, then there's no basis for politicians to continue to operate in a warlike manner. We'll be able to convince them, and the senior scientists from those countries, once they see those results, should be able to convince their politicians that this is empirical evidence, science has said this, let's meet together and celebrate and don't continue to have tensions. So that's another initiative that the academy is undertaking, slightly different from the other issues. So this is what I was just talking to you about. I've covered that already in terms of the Frontiers Foundation. Yeah, it's the same slide. Now, this is probably about my last slide. There are certain projects that are so huge that one country cannot do it, one region cannot do it. This one is a recent photo about the desert locust. Now, we've had outbreaks consecutively for 3 years, usually starting from the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Tanzania, Kenya, and they work all their way down to Namibia, South Africa. In the case of last year, the outbreak of the desert locust extended all the way to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So this kind of problem is very complicated. It's complex, it's huge, it does require significant investment, and it requires joint efforts in order to be able to overcome it. So this is a compelling reason why science diplomacy is the route to go. If it's a localized problem, it's okay. Nationally, you can move with it, or continentally. But when you get something like that, you have to involve other countries, and so science diplomacy then become the route if we are to resolve complex problems and/or undertake big global projects for societal development. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Dakora. For the audience, I just want to put one point into perspective. While Prof. Dakora has talked about the African Academy of Science as being a pan-African association, there are about 28 national academies on the African continent that form part of this network, the network of African science academies. So you would have seen on one of Professor Dakora's slides where he, particularly the one with the trans-boundary water dispute, where he mentioned NASAC in that slide. So in the interest of science diplomacy, I think you had one slide missing, where you should have showed that association of the linkage of the AAS within the context of NASAC. But I just wanted to say that we're very proud of what you're doing, and to build the science diplomacy capacity, we should engage a little bit more with the other national academies. So that's the slide you got to add for the next presentation. Anyway, so you see, when you're the moderator, you have the prerogative of having a voice, and I'm exercising it. All right, now I'm very excited to call Mr. Alexis Roeg to talk about what they do at DiploHub. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Chair. It's a pleasure to share the stage with such an outstanding group of speakers and friends, and as well as partnering with GESDA and the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa to host this session, where we are aiming at bringing complementary views and perspectives on science diplomacy from the ones we've been discussing for the last couple of days. And I've been asked to talk today about the role of cities as emerging actors in science diplomacy, and share with you the example, the case study of Barcelona as the world's first city implementing a science and technology diplomacy strategy. So just in the session previous to this one, there were some questions about new actors in science diplomacy, the role of the private sector, global NGOs. And I wanted to put the focus on how a new global order is obviously emerging by the relevant role of all these actors, but as well another emerging actor, which is cities. This global order emerging around cities and their markets rather than nation states and their hard borders is reshaping how we understand international relations. We've seen in the last years how the economic relevance of cities growing, and continents like Africa and the fast-growing cities in the continent are the engine of these changes. In the next couple of years, the 600 major cities in the world will be responsible of over 65% of the global economic growth. And by 2050, 70% of the population is going to be urban. That's just an example of how relevant the role of cities is from a societal and an economic perspective. And that's why we say more and more that the future of multilateralism is also urban, is metropolitan. And we've seen recently, during the pandemic and the years before, how when national governments withdraw from their global responsibilities, cities gain influence. We saw these when, for example, the US federal government withdraw from the Paris Agreement during Trump administration, and major cities in the country pledged to stay committed to their part in the Paris Agreement. We saw these when several European and North American countries withdraw from the UN Global Compact on Migration, and major cities were supporting hosting refugees and migrant people. So this is the space that national governments are sometimes leaving to cities. And in this sense, in the same way that we have been talking in the last days, that science and technology are reshaping international relations, and national governments are using science diplomacy, are leveraging science as a tool for diplomacy, and we see how cities are more and more relevant in the global stage, developing their own forms of city diplomacy. It was just about time that cities is starting also getting active agents, active stakeholders in science diplomacy. And in 2018, Barcelona wanted to take the lead in this regard and became the world's first city with a science and technology diplomacy strategy. The entire scientific ecosystem of the city, all the university presidents, all the directors of its research centers, all the former mayors of the city, ministers, as well as all the other actors in the science, technology, and public policy sector, they came together to launch what it was at the time a manifesto that I invite you to check online. You have the website on screen. That was the seed of the creation of what today is the Science and Technology Diplomacy Hub in Barcelona. This manifesto and the creation of this entity aim at positioning Barcelona as a global laboratory for science diplomacy, where we can identify best practices in science diplomacy, test them in the city, and see how this can also be useful for others, because one of the main goals of the hub is that Barcelona is not the first and only city with a science diplomacy, but it can also pave the way for others to come. So TIDEC Diplo Hub was created, and I think that's interesting compared to how traditionally science diplomacy has been deployed and exerted from national governments as a non-profit public-private partnership where the city government, the regional government, all the universities, the research centers, the private sector, philanthropic institutions have a role in the governance of this science diplomacy strategy at the urban level. I wanted to share with you, if the slides, if I manage to pass the slides, I wanted to share with you some of the examples on how a city can deploy the science diplomacy activities, and how these can also be a model or an example or ideas to be executed, implemented in the African context. Obviously, a big part of when we talk about science diplomacy, a big part of it can be sometimes just under the umbrella of what we understand as public diplomacy, as outreach, bringing the voice of the city's science and technology ecosystems to local fora, to global events, to where the global agendas are discussed. This is an important part of what TIDEC Diplo Hub does for Barcelona, what I have to do as Barcelona's chief science envoy, bringing Barcelona's voice to forums like this one. We just came back from Egypt a few weeks ago at the COP27, representing what the universities in the city, the tech startups, though in this case, against towards the fight for climate change. In the same way, TIDEC Diplo Hub brings the voice and the interest and the priorities of the city's science ecosystem to global foreign entities as member of the International Science Council, observatory status at the Economic and Social Committee of the United Nations, the UN Environmental Program, the Planetary Health Alliance. So this space that was traditionally not an urban space that Barcelona is trying to position its science and technology diplomacy as an example, as well as obviously reaching a general and broader audience through explaining the role of science diplomacy to the general public. One of the priorities when positioning Barcelona as a place to be in science diplomacy is supporting building capacities in science diplomacy, and this is a topic that has been around in the next couple of days and that we have the chance to discuss later with the colleagues from GESDA. Barcelona hosts every year an executive training on science diplomacy, and I know we have many former participants in the room today, as well as former speakers as well, that gather every year in Barcelona. Over 60 executives, government officials, scientists from national academies from over 30 different countries in Barcelona to get trained at the intersection of science, technology, and global affairs. This is a flagship training we developed there, but that our capacity building programs go way beyond. By 2026, all universities in Barcelona are going to offer to all their students, whether they study natural sciences, social science, humanities, science diplomacy courses. This is already an option for over 30% of the universities in the city, and that's going to be available for all students in the next 3 years. And in the same way, we support diplomatic schools, national academies in over 25 different countries on their science diplomacy capacity building. In the same way as the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa is starting working on, we engage with the diplomatic community in Barcelona and Spain. That's the project we call Diplomatic Circle. So every other month, ambassadors based in Madrid, consul generals of the over 100 general consulates in Barcelona, as well as science attaché of those institutions. They go to visit pioneering projects in science and technology taking place at universities, research centers, private companies in Greater Barcelona in an attempt to bring closer the scientific and technological ecosystems of all the countries that are represented by those diplomatic missions and the one in Barcelona. And that's something that's been active for almost 5 years already, and really promising projects have came out of these relationships that were built during these visits. In the same way that just a few minutes ago, I was explaining how we take part, we participate, we speak in all these sort of like relevant international events and fora on science and governance. Barcelona also brings its own format of event around the world, which is what we call the Barcelona Innovation Days. Every year, Barcelona selects one host city, which is another relevant scientific and technological hub, to host the Barcelona Innovation Days, and for several days we fly all our university presidents, directors of research centers, CEOs of tech startups, public policy officers, among other relevant actors from our ecosystem, and we invite the ones of the ecosystem we are visiting, and for a few days we exchange best practices on science policy, science diplomacy, tech transfer, talent attraction and retention, and whatever topics on science and technology might be relevant for both ecosystems. You're seeing on screen the one we did in Boston together with the government of Boston, Massachusetts, Harvard, and MIT. But in the last years, we've been in London, Shanghai. We just came back from Mexico City 3 weeks ago, where we, apart from having a wonderful time and getting to know the ecosystem there, Barcelona signed an MOU with Mexico City to enhance and foster scientific cooperation between two cities, as well as support the capacity building in science diplomacy for the federal government of Mexico. So those are examples of how cities, with their limited capacities in the structure of global governance, but at the same time with the flexibility that they have, can play a relevant role on science diplomacy. Part of the Global Policy Lab is a think tank part of SciTech DiploHub, which allows us to work with international organizations, foreign countries, foreign cities, in supporting their science diplomacy strategies and work. And I also wanted to mention a project that is one of our flagship projects, because I saw that the topic about diasporas has been mentioned a lot, and it is obviously scientific diasporas are a really relevant topic for a region like Africa. Barcelona identified that as a global city with a really interesting and competitive landscape of scientific and higher education institutions was attracting literally hundreds of thousands of students and scholars every year to the city, but its private sector had not enough capacity to absorb all this workforce. And in an attempt to get connected to all this talent that was educated in Barcelona, but was flying away to go back to their countries or go to their third countries, we launched the Barcelona Alumni Network. This is not a university alumni network. We're talking here about a city-wide, an ecosystem-wide alumni network. Barcelona alumni gather all the professionals from any origin. That at some point they studied at any of the universities of the city, they did research at any of the research centers, and that now they are abroad. They are the city's science and technology diaspora. A network that currently gathers almost 2,000 members in over 30 countries, and they are all the brightest men and women that were educated in Barcelona and that now sit in positions of responsibilities in foreign governments, international universities, private companies. And as you can imagine, they are a core part, a central part of the science diplomacy strategy of the city, because they help us to identify opportunities, open doors. They help us to follow trends that we might not be aware of. And obviously, we include them and we involve them in all sorts of activities. You're seeing on screen the annual gathering we do in Barcelona, where we invite hundreds of them so they can reconnect with what's going on in the scientific and technological infrastructures and projects in the city. And we also built a science policy nexus project where all this talent that was educated in Barcelona, but that now they are elsewhere, can contribute to the policy-making system of the city. So towards a digital platform, they can inform policies for the local government. And we can talk about later if you want, but this is yet another example of connecting science diplomacy with science policy, which, as it was mentioned in the previous session, is definitely not exactly the same thing. Well, this is the digital platform I was talking about. So, well, that was just like my 5 cents about how cities, and particularly the case of Barcelona, how cities can contribute to science and technology diplomacy, and how this can also be a model that could be adapted to the idiosyncrasy and the circumstances and the role of fast-growing cities in Africa. And I'm sure that later on we'll have the chance to discuss more about this topic. Thank you so much.
You started to restore my faith in believing in science diplomacy with your city model, but I'm still not convinced. So you're going to have to think about how you're going to convince me that everything you talked about does not have its individual place, and how is it that science diplomacy comes in? Because I think we over-exaggerate these sound bites of terminology, but I like the model of how you brought together various aspects of the players, the stakeholders, the actors into the room to gameplay on advancing and, you know, the impact of where science has a place in the development of society. But I'm still not sure it's diplomacy, but you're going to have to convince me. Well, another person who I believe is going to try to convince me is Dr. Marga Gold-Soler, and she's from Gestung. And she's going to talk to us about science diplomacy, anticipating the future. Here goes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here after 3 years, reconnect with so many friends and colleagues after this the hiatus we've had. It's a very special edition of the World Science Forum, first in Africa. So thanks so much for the invitation, and especially to the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa initiative for hosting us and giving us this space and opportunity. So my name is Marga Gold-Soler. I am the head of Science Diplomacy Capacity Building at GESDA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. We are a fairly new organization, and we are here to introduce ourselves and hopefully establish partnerships with all of you. If I can have my slides, great, thank you. So yes, we are Swiss. Let me start. Actually, before saying who we are, I will say why we exist. So it has been said throughout the conference already, and just picking up from Peter Gluckman's questions earlier today, we all know and recognize how fast the scientific and technological progress is happening, and how policy and regulation is always falling behind. This, I think, is established, and it's a soundbite, as it has been said. The question of why science is not a stakeholder in multilateralism was also posed by Peter Gluckman. So hopefully I'm going to try to answer those two questions throughout this session, and how we can go about using science diplomacy beyond the sound bites and before the slogans for actual change. So GESDA is a Swiss foundation founded by the Federal Council of Switzerland, so the federal government, as well as the city and the canton of Geneva. Why Geneva? Geneva is the city in the world with the most density of international organizations. It is the headquarters, the European headquarters of the United Nations. It has the highest density of embassies, of permanent missions, of international organizations, of multinational companies. And this creates a unique ecosystem for science to come into play and shape the future of multilateralism. Here you can see some of the history of how Geneva became the center of international multilateralism. And I can only mention a few of the actors that might be immediately recognizable to you, such as CERN, which was presented as one of the landmarks of science diplomacy already throughout to this conference, and the number of actors that are located and placed in international Geneva, all of the UN agencies that you see here, but also many others. So Geneva is a place for science to become, to enter, to infuse the multilateral system with the knowledge, with the evidence, and with the anticipatory capacity to understand what scientific developments are coming in the future, and how do we put in place the diplomatic envelopes early enough so we can be proactive about harnessing their benefits and steering them in the direction of global benefit and not undesirable or consequences that might not be of benefit for all. So this is at the heart of this concept of science diplomacy anticipation. And I guess that we use the slogan, use the future to build the present. How do we do that? We bring together the scientists that are working at the forefront of the respective scientific fields that can tell us what are they working on right now, but is going to be ready perhaps in 5, 10, 25 years. So it's not the scientific advancements that we have in the market today. It's the scientific advancements that are going to be out in this horizon of 25 years, but we need to prepare for them in advance, and we cannot wait until they are ready to be deployed, and then they are out in the world. We have seen many technologies, many scientific innovations that have not been steered towards global benefit. So how do we widen the beneficiaries of science and technology through anticipation? And this is the topic of Science for Social Justice of this World Science Forum. You are all familiar with the original definition and framework for science diplomacy created by, or put forward by AAAS and the Royal Society in 2010, the 3 pillars of science diplomacy. We all know about them. But given this new context in which we are in, the unprecedented pace of science and innovation, the urgency, the ever urgent pressure to address our global challenges together, and the complexity of global geopolitics and the fractures and the retreat from multilateralism that we are seeing. So this is the paradox. We need to come together more than ever because all of those challenges transcend national boundaries. But our multilateral system is perhaps weaker than ever. And we have seen this with COVID response. We have seen this with climate negotiations not advancing as fast as we would like to. Therefore, I guess that we established this the methodology of from knowledge to action. How do we move from knowledge to action is by anticipating, accelerating, and translating. And that means, first of all, anticipating the scientific developments that are going to be mature in the horizon of 25 years, and then accelerating their benefits for the biggest majority of people and mitigate the potential and the undesirable consequences before those innovations are already out and impossible to control. And I don't say control in a bad way, right? Because sometimes when we think about regulation, we have this negative connotation that we need to stop certain technologies because they are harmful, but the same technologies that can save lives and produce life-saving cures are the same ones that can be used for harm, right? So we have to balance those two and to not stifle innovation and allow the positive and the beneficial outcomes to be accelerated. And then it's about translation. How do we ensure that these scientific advancements actually make it, and we need a coalition of actors from all of the stakeholders of the multilateral system to be able to implement, to action them. So in a nutshell, it is from cutting-edge research to bringing stakeholders together to solutions and actions. How do we do that? The first step is scouting and anticipating what those scientific developments will be. So our flagship product, if you will, is called the JESDA Science Breakthrough Radar. You can find it online in this website that I'm showing here. This is a yearly update, a survey of the scientists working at the cutting edge of scientific fields to tell us how do they see the field evolving and where the field is going, so then we can capture that information, translate it, put it into the hands of the diplomacy community, and together decide collectively how we're going to steer these technologies. The JESDA Breakthrough Radar, it is produced on an annual basis. And as you can see in this map, it is still a long way to go to have representation of scientists from all around the world. And this is also why we are here, because we really need to widen the contributions to scientific, to inform the scientific breakthroughs of the future from all around the world. We work on 4 scientific platforms, so we cluster the topics. You know, there's an infinite number of topics that you could think of, and what we do is we pick 4 platforms, those topics that are most likely to have geopolitical, diplomatic, governance, societal implications. First platform is artificial intelligence and quantum technologies. Second platform is human augmentation, so everything from neurotechnology, brain-computer interfaces, gene editing, and these biomedical applications. Third platform, eco-regeneration and geoengineering, so everything that has to do with decarbonization, with the governance of climate-altering technologies. For example, things like solar radiation management, modification, you might be familiar with it. Those are technologies that are not yet ready to deploy, but when they are, we cannot be reactive to them because they're going to have massive geopolitical, societal implications, and we need to be proactive many, many years before they are ready, and we need to decide as a collective civilization how we are going to deploy them or not, and what's going to be the governance mechanism system for it. And the fourth platform is science and diplomacy. So what new instruments, what new mechanisms do we need for science diplomacy to be effective? And this is, for example, the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa initiative would fall squarely into that platform. So this is all about radar. You can have a print copy of the book. It weighs 1 kilo 400. So if you have space in your suitcase, you can take it back. If not, you can browse it online. And I'll just say a few words about what we're going to discuss later, because I realize that we're going to have more of a conversation. But all of this has to be translated into pedagogy, right, into educational materials to train the people who are going to be negotiating these issues 5, 10, 25 years from now. So we are launching a global science diplomacy curriculum. Is one of the solution ideas that come out of this radar, of this work of anticipating and scouting what's going to be necessary for the next 25 years of science diplomacy. The idea is not so much about training for jobs, and we can discuss that. I'd love to ask the panel and the audience, what do you think science diplomacy training is for? Because many people think that there are jobs in science diplomacy, and actually there are very, very few. It's more about a mindset, having we call it bilingual or multilingual mindset, to be able to understand both the scientific and technical and complexities and the governance and the diplomatic envelopes that are required, and have this shared language and bringing those communities together to navigate the interface. So we have a number of programs. One, the most advanced is the Science Diplomacy Week. We bring participants to Geneva for an immersion program in the science and diplomacy ecosystem of International Geneva. All of these actors that I showed you on that map are the partners that immerse the program in. And hopefully that helps elevate the standing of International Geneva as a hub for science and diplomacy for the future of multilateralism. But it's not only about this networking and immersion, it's also innovation in what is it that we are teaching and what the tools we are providing. So for example, we have new topics like computational diplomacy, negotiation engineering. So we are training participants to take back those tools to their foreign ministries, to the diplomatic academies, to make sure the latest tools are available for all. So you are invited to apply. The call will be out soon. The next Science Diplomacy Week is 8 to 12 May 2023. And those who are not interested in the training program, they can also come, because the Science Diplomacy Week has an open forum component, which means there are sessions and opportunities open to the public. So it's not only about this training opportunity specifically. And you can see below this slide the partners that are members of this initiative. So there are universities, the UN, the International Parliamentary Union, CERN, different think tanks and training institutions in Geneva, but also in Zurich, so University of Zurich and ETH, so it's not only a Geneva-only initiative, and of course international partners like the International Science Council and INCSA. So here we have Remy Quirion, one of our esteemed partners in the implementation, to make sure this is not a Swiss initiative, this is a global initiative. And I would love to discuss how we can support the SDCFA in developing the similar capacity building programs that are in the pipeline. And the topic of this, just my last word, the topic of this conference is science for social justice. And we have a very strong partnership with the University of Cape Town. Professor Mamogeti Pakeng is one of the board members of JESNA, and just yesterday we hosted this discussion together with UCT, focusing on the anticipation and youth. So the idea that we need to work with all segments of society, but especially youth, because this is the youngest continent in the world. And also, when we're talking about horizons of 25 years, people who are going to be leaders at that time are the young people of today. So we really want to work from all the educational levels. And importantly, science for social justice means intergenerational justice. It means that these innovations that we're talking about can deepen divides, or they can help us address them. So the world will be perhaps divided between those who have access to cognitive enhancement technologies and those who have not. The world will be divided between those who have access to quantum technologies and those who have not. So we need to make sure that those benefits are shared by all, and this is the social justice and the intergenerational justice that JESNA is looking to support with collaboration from all of you. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. You should have been on the panel I was in earlier this morning on the What If symposium about contextualizing the curiosity of science for the future, because you seem to have the crystal ball to work from the future to the present. Normally, evolutionary theory tells us we work from the past to understand the present, to predict the future. So that's quite an interesting concept that you've shared with us. Anyway, colleagues, we need to move on, and our last speaker is Dr. Jan-Marco Müller, and he's going to tell us about the supranatural coordination of science diplomacy. So now we're going to have to move this thing way up for you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm going to talk to you as a practitioner who works at the coal phase of science and diplomacy. If in times of phasing out fossil fuels, we are still allowed to talk about coal phases. And I want to talk, indeed, if I can have the slides, please, about supranational, not supernatural, but supranational coordination of science diplomacy. So in a way, the other end of the spectrum as compared to the local level. And I want to share with you a little bit the practical experiences which we have in the European Union, trying to bring together member states to think about science diplomacy. So, of course, as you all know, and as you heard also earlier in the speeches today, science diplomacy has become very popular in the last roughly 15 years or so. Some may even say hyped to some extent. But in a way, there are very valuable initiatives happening, and we just heard about two of them with JESTA and Barcelona SkyTech DiploHub, or the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa in Pretoria. There have been lots of publications, lots of initiatives, declarations, and a whole kind of community of scholars and practitioners developing. And EU member states, they have started developing science or tech diplomacy strategies. So roughly a third of the EU member states have already adopted them, and other member states are exploring and reflecting about, which shows really the growing importance also in foreign ministries. And this comes along with ministries of foreign affairs appointing science diplomacy experts. And they come in very different forms. They can be chief science officers, special envoy for science diplomacy, an ambassador at large for science and innovation, etc., etc. And that's something which is really important, because the talk and a discourse about science diplomacy has been very much been dominated from the science side. And what we need to strengthen is actually the demand side. The foreign ministries that really are discovering more and more this topic, also in view, of course, of the global challenges we are facing and of the technologies that are developing very quickly. And you see here on the picture on the right-hand side, that was the first physical meeting of these people, science people in the foreign ministries. They were meeting earlier this year at ITER, at the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, which is, in fact, with all due respect to the SKA ones, I think the most exciting science diplomacy project at the moment, where the European Union, the United States, Japan, Korea, India, China, and Russia are trying to build together a big machine against all political and technical odds. A lot has been happening at the European Union level as well. So we had 3 science diplomacy projects that were funded by the Horizon 2020 program. And they've given birth now to what is called the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance, which is a platform that gathers the research community around science diplomacy. We have different working groups that have looked into science diplomacy. It's increasingly picked up in, if you read recent policy documents, it's more and more science diplomacy is popping up in these papers. But at the same time, we also need to be aware that, of course, science diplomacy itself is changing. Yeah? And a couple of years ago, we were still in what I call the honeymoon phase of science diplomacy. And we're talking about all the great good things science diplomacy can do in terms of building bridges, keeping doors open. But the discourse has become much more nuanced in recent years. We are talking now about foreign interference, for instance. And if you think of the famous SSS Royal Society definition, actually the 4th dimension, diplomacy in science, was not mentioned there, but in last month we have only been discussing about diplomacy in science when we're discussing about scientific sanctions. Not only those imposed by governments, but actually by universities or research institutions themselves imposing sanctions. So also science diplomacy is evolving. And what we are facing in Europe, at least, is largely uncoordinated science diplomacy efforts, with a lot of merits, with a lot of best practices, certainly, but there's a lack of EU approach, and this in times of a rapidly changing geopolitical environment, but also a rapidly changing scientific and technological environment. And what we like to achieve is to develop European leadership in science diplomacy to project soft power and pursue European interests and values more effectively. This may sound shocking to some, but of course, at the end of the day, you do science diplomacy because you want to achieve and advance diplomatic goals. And many of these interests and values are actually shared with partner countries around the world. If you think about a common interest like combating climate change, like achieving the SDGs, or values like academic freedom, or research integrity and others which we want to achieve together with our partners. And against all this backdrop, the Council of the European Union, so that's the body that represents the member states, they adopted conclusions last year on what is called the Global Approach to Research Innovation, which is the new EU International Science and Technology Strategy. And they asked to develop a European science diplomacy agenda to explore mechanisms for cooperation and science diplomacy, and also to integrate this science strategy, the international science in the global approach and research innovation, into the Union's external policies. And it's quite interesting, this initiative comes from the member states. They feel actually we need to do more together to find synergies between what we're doing. And when I heard this for the first time, I immediately asked myself 3 questions. What do we mean by European? What do we mean by science diplomacy? And what do we mean by agenda? And the answer to this question is not at all trivial, I can tell you. Starting with what is European? Because Europe in research is different than Europe in foreign policy. The European research area includes, of course, the Western Balkans, Turkey, Norway, and many other countries. The common foreign and security policy, that's the EU 27. And not all countries that are associated to the Horizon Research Program, they are not necessarily sharing foreign policy goals of the EU. At the same time, of course, research policy is a shared responsibility. We have national research policies, we have the EU Research Framework Program, but foreign policy is a national sovereignty issue. It's a national issue of the member states. So again, we are kind of hitting here the problems of bringing together the research and the diplomacy, the science and the diplomacy spheres. And what we really want to achieve is a Team Europe approach, as we call it now, where both the European institutions and the member states act together. And of course, we can't do this in isolation, because we need to work, of course, with partners abroad that also looking into science, developing their science diplomacy. And I actually don't like so much this term like-minded partners, because they may be like-minded in some topics, but not at all like-minded on other topics. And then what do you mean by science diplomacy? You might think, yeah, science diplomacy, it's clear, we all know what we are talking about. But actually, if you get to the detail, you see all these terms flying around. Science diplomacy, tech diplomacy, innovation diplomacy, STI diplomacy. Alexis was just using on the slide science and technology diplomacy. Sometimes they seem to mean the same, sometimes they mean to seem different things. Sometimes science diplomacy is used as a kind of umbrella term. And at the same time, we have a mushrooming of thematic diplomacies. Climate diplomacy, water, energy, digital, space, Arctic, etc. diplomacy. And what I find very often where diplomats are then reluctant is when they say, yeah, science diplomacy, that's yet another of those diplomacies which will eat into our budget. And it's difficult then to explain to them that actually science is underpinning all these diplomacies. So science diplomacy is really cross-cutting across all of them. So what we want to do when we talk about European science diplomacy agenda is really to understand science diplomacy in the broadest sense: natural sciences, social science, humanities, engineering, medicine, education. And what we want to do is to focus with it on the how. How can we bring the worlds of science and diplomacy together, and not so much on the what. Of course, the what is important, be it climate, be it oceans, be it also geographical, you know, China, Russia, etc., etc. But the worst thing we can do is to interfere with all these ongoing policy processes, because I can tell you the foreign policy domain is full of landmines, and probably I've already stepped on one or two of them during my presentation. And then the question, what do we mean by agenda? So what is actually the outcome? That's another issue that is currently being discussed. What kind of legal product is this going to be? Or is it just a to-do list? Or, you know, this also, of course, relates to the level of ambition. What we certainly want to see is something, or what member states want to see is something which is non-binding, which is based on voluntary commitments from them. So we are not going to tell them that's the science diplomacy you need to do. But at the same time, member states want something which is forward-looking, which is suggesting concrete actions. So we need to think on kind of, you know, what kind of legal end product we are going to have, and that's not yet decided. But then how we want to do it is very important that this is done in a co-creation with participants from the science and diplomacy spheres. Because that's actually, for me, more important than the end product is actually the process, because that's where we bring the scientists and the diplomats into one room to talk to each other. And then, of course, whatever comes out of it in terms of recommendation needs to be kind of verified by stakeholders in terms of reality check, because at the end of the day, we want to make a difference in the real world, and that means that everybody needs to own it and, at the end, implement it. Now, in the process, what we have done is we've established a steering team which is composed in equal parts from people from the science and the diplomacy spheres. So from member states, research ministries, from foreign ministries. That's why I'm saying I'm not just herding 27 cats, but actually 54 cats, because 27 research ministries and 27 foreign ministries. Plus, of course, all the other stakeholders, the EU Science Diplomacy Alliance, the academic community, etc. And we have developed this kind of initial thought I want to share with you is we're thinking about 3 delivery mechanisms. The first one is about strengthening the interactions between research and innovation policy and foreign policy. So really in a way of creating structural linkages. To give a practical example, we started negotiations of associating Canada to Horizon Europe. The European Research Framework of course, has a foreign policy dimension. Then thinking about the science advisory ecosystems, again, the structures we want to create it. Well developed in some areas, think of IPCC, much less well developed in other areas. The role of science diplomacies and embassies and delegations, the role of science attachés, who are not just there to promote your country or your region as a way to, as a space to do research, but also increasingly become science advisors to the ambassadors. And then, of course, the issue of the global outreach to our partners worldwide, but also think of, you know, the engagement with diaspora scientists, with alumni of mobility schemes, etc. So it's really these kind of structural linkages. The second pillar of it is what I would call making diplomacy resilient through foresight, evidence, and strategic use of scientific cooperation. I'm not going to talk about foresight because that has already been tackled by Marga. But here we need to think about, of course, the role of science in tackling crisis, and we have seen, of course, and Peter Gluckman talked about earlier in connection with the COVID pandemic, the role of science diplomacy in strengthening multilateralism, the issue of the global commons, which are increasingly becoming militarized, politicized, commercialized. Just think of a US-American billionaire who is owning already half of all active satellites in Earth orbit. The role of science diplomacy in supporting public diplomacy, a very important aspect, so the building of narratives, the combating of disinformation. And then, which is of course the hot topic of the day, is science diplomacy in times of war and when relations are difficult, and what it can do and what it can't do. And then finally, the third pillar is definitely building capacity for European science diplomacy. And here we are thinking on the one hand, of course, building capacity in science, strengthening science diplomacy as a research subject, but also making researchers aware that their research might have positive or negative geopolitical implications. And of course, building capacity in diplomacy. It's really about, you know, making sure science and technology are part of the curricula of the diplomatic academies, of the pre-posting training, etc., and kind of really training also the literacy in a way of diplomats to make it easier to engage with science. But then we also need to look at the interface, also at the careers at the interface of people who are experts actually in translating between the two worlds. And that's something which is, of course, very important we need to look at. So these are, in a way, the kind of main topics we want to tackle, and we are going to establish early next year working groups with participation from these different stakeholder communities to develop these recommendations. And I want to conclude coming back to actually the topic we want to discuss, and that's social justice. And as also Peter Gluckman very nicely earlier explained, I mean, we live in a quite strange world of increased fragmentation and polarization between nations, but also within nations and within societies. What we really need to think of is how can we invent a modern science diplomacy that is fit for this strange new world we live in to really deliver social justice. And that is really not just about rebooting, it's really about reimagining science diplomacy and what it can do. And for this, we need fully to engage also with the diplomatic spheres and fully get them on board in the discussions from the outset. And at the end of the day, of course, what we want is concrete, not just a nice list of recommendations, but something very concrete, which is actionable, which can be implemented. For instance, we have just launched the African Union, European Union Innovation Agenda, where the two bodies, the African Union and the European Union, work together in, you know, really connecting the research programs and thinking about how can we boost innovation that benefits then the citizens on both sides. And of course, social justice is something that always looms behind of it as one of these key issues that we want to achieve. And again, for this, what we really need is to think how science diplomacy can respond to these challenges. Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, spoken not by the mouth of babes, but experts in the field. But before I open up the discussion, I'd just like to engage with Alexis and Marga in terms of what are the criteria for developing a science diplomacy curriculum. And when you do that, what is the highlight? What is the punchline? Not collaboration, not about bringing together the different parties, not about the foresight. It's like, what is the punchline that you want in this curriculum that you want to develop?
Want to go?
Okay, I give you our framework, which is still in development, but basically it's about knowledge, competence, and networks. So we divide the curriculum across these three pillars. For first, knowledge. So what is it that the scientists should know about diplomacy, and this is all very simplified, right? But as Gianmarco was saying, what is it that scientists need to understand about the implications of the research that they're working on for these geopolitical, diplomatic, governance implications? And what is it that the diplomats, for example, in diplomatic academies, should have as part of the curriculum, because they're going to be facing negotiations and issues in this technical, ever-growing technical complexity. Now, this is not to say that all the scientists should become diplomats, to take the jobs of the diplomats. This is a concern sometimes in the way some of these things are framed. And it's not about the diplomats becoming quantum physicists, because, I mean, this is also impossible. I mean, they could, some do, but the idea is not that you get a second degree or a third degree on a scientific field if you're a diplomat, or vice versa. The idea is to have this shared language, this shared mindset, and the basic notions of why this scientific issue is going to impact diplomacy and in what way, and who do you need to call when you need to talk about it. Then the competencies and the tools. So, for example, new tools for diplomacy, AI and machine learning, are changing the way negotiations are conducted. So how do we upskill our diplomatic services, our negotiation teams, to be able to harness these tools and then make negotiations more effectively? For example, using negotiation engineering and computational diplomacy, you can sometimes depoliticize some of the issues, even though they are inherently political, but at least you can agree on what is the evidence that you are going to agree to use. And then the political layer, of course, comes on top of it, but at least we can agree on a set of facts. So the IPCC is, for example, a tool that gives the climate negotiators the basis, the evidence that the world climate scientists agree upon to base the negotiations on. And then the third one is access and networks. So, for example, this is what we do when we bring people together in Geneva. So it's not just about bringing people together. It's like, who do I need to talk if I want to have a conversation with WHO about antimicrobial resistance from my country? I want to anchor my policy to that framework. So who do I need? How do I access those stakeholders? And I think that the divide is sometimes not knowing who to call or who to knock the door on the other side of the other community. So these three pillars, I think, together, developing the components to each of them, which is a huge undertaking. It is not simple, but at least we can structure the curriculum along those three pillars to be able to move from this understanding that we need science diplomacy in the abstract to actually moving to an actual process.
I couldn't agree more, Marga. I totally second this point about you were saying earlier in your presentation, this multilingualism, or giving the tools to scientists to be able to talk politics and diplomacy, and the other way around. It always looked very difficult from each one side. So like diplomats always say like, no, I mean, science diplomacy is mainly for scientists, right? And when you talk to scientists, like, no, I mean, I'm not from international relations background. I would never be able to do science diplomacy. And at the end of the day, is as you were saying, you don't need to get a PhD on the other topic, but just like to be able to understand the processes, the timings of science and the policy making. And we saw plenty of examples of this lack of understanding of these differences during the pandemic, and how like scientists were like, I mean, we just know this and that, why politicians are doing this other thing? And politicians saying like, no, well, science is not telling us with enough certainty, and these are the other thing. And then as well as like giving the tools to be able to tap on those networks when you need to make a call and get some last minute information about a topic, and that this thing is not alien to do your everyday work. And then I would add also making this accessible. So it's not at the end of the day an elite that has access to these kind of trainings. It's just like privileged scientists or privileged diplomats that get to specialize or get these trainings and tools on this, but that this is widely accessible to anybody studying sciences, studying humanities. So it's not like, and this connects also with what you were saying earlier during your presentation about jobs in science diplomacy, but which is like totally connected with this more like educational thing we were discussing. But I'm sure that if this is of the interest of the audience, we can keep discussing during the Q&A.
Right. So science operates in a world where you have the scientists and the academics who are the generation of this knowledge capital. Then you have the business who may find something innovative from the science that is produced, either by the scientists or they may internally do that sort of R&D themselves. Then you have the policymakers, and it seems to me that in this diplomacy sector, the policymakers have a very important role to play nationally and then internationally. And of course, the public, who are the citizens, who are the people that we do the science for. So, better known as a quadruple helix, these are the components of it. So now, in all of these things that you're doing with this exciting work of this Barcelona model and the futuristic projects, etc., what is the essence of bringing these 4 components into that dialogue? Alex, you kind of, introduced that concept when you talked about the Barcelona city model. But I'm sorry, I'm a skeptic in this business. Because as scientists, we grow up doing research, collaborating, applying for grants, doing all of those things, publishing, and every step of the way in that pipeline, there's a whole lot of activities which are a buzz about. And suddenly these big words come, science diplomacy. And I mean, I can understand it from a political point of view, being a political engager, how you need to be diplomatic. I mean, you don't swear, you don't use all those as much as I would love to, but I have to be diplomatic in terms of how I engage. So it would seem to me that we are muddling the science environment space with this political kind of framework. And that's where I have a problem. And from all the talks we've had this afternoon, I'm still struggling. What is the essence of this buzzwords, science diplomacy? I appreciate the collaboration, I appreciate the capacity building, I appreciate the networks and all of that. I see it together, but what I'm lacking is seeing that alignment, like our double-stranded DNA held together by the hydrogen bond. What is the hydrogen bonds here?
Well, I would say that if we want to consider it a buzzword, it totally is. I mean, I think Jan was mentioning the hype about science diplomacy. Science diplomacy is not a magic stick that is fixing everything, or through scientific knowledge, we're gonna have peace world forever. And that I think my understanding of science diplomacy is way far from this. So it's also about managing expectations. So that's why it's important to explaining what science diplomacy is and making scientists understand what are the expectations of science diplomacy and the scientific knowledge that is brought to policymakers or diplomats. So we don't have this mismatch between what each one is understanding about it and then obviously having this kind of feeling you say you're having, that despite of being listening for the last couple of days, many people mentioning the science diplomacy, you still feel like it's just a buzzword that some used to feel the stage.
I can see the 2 strands. I don't see how it's joining. That's my problem. And maybe I'm just being stupid, which I can say I am.
Let me try to answer to you, because I think you're pointing at a very important misalignment also of incentives. And the way our systems, the academic systems, diplomatic systems are set up. So academic researchers normally and typically don't get rewarded for any of this policy diplomacy engagement. This is something that Clarissa was pointing out just before, right? So everything that is engaged or translating or getting the knowledge out of the university out for a academic purpose, meaning getting a grant or publishing in a scientific journal, is not rewarded. So many scientists that would like to see their knowledge have more impact in those societal policy.
So we call that science engagement.
Right, but the thing is, how do you align the incentives, meaning that allowing the scientists to have that platform and to have that access, but then the diplomatic incentives as well.
Send them to science engagement school.
To receive, no, but then you need the uptake, you need the supply and the demand, and the misalignment and the mis-expectation that Alex is talking about is that because of the numbers, so if you look at the number of diplomats is fixed in a country and is capped at entry. The number of scientists is unlimited in principle and is capped at the end, meaning that you can go through a PhD postdoc, 5 postdocs, 10 postdocs, and at the age of 50, you can decide that you're sick of not getting ahead because of the current different, and this is not to now start with the problems of the academic system, that requires another conference. But basically, you can go through a scientific career, and then you can kind of drop out, and then you have, and this is what we're seeing, a lot of interest of getting into science diplomacy, science policy, science communication, because the academic system cannot fit everyone and doesn't provide those incentives and rewards. The diplomatic community is fixed. You know, Switzerland has 11 new diplomats every year. That cannot change. It is a process that is mandated by the government, so there are no more diplomats. What can we do? We can build this partnership and hybrid profiles that supplement the official diplomatic corps, the foreign service, which is, as Gianmarco was pointing out, very well regulated and regulated, meaning that there is no, you know, the foreign policy is fixed by a country and nobody can interfere with that. But having those boundary spanning actors in between allows us to complement and fix some of these problems from both communities that I think point at some of the tensions that you refer to.
All right. Felix, help us out. The trans-border issue with the water crisis, there you've got political boundaries, you've got water issues. Now, how did the science intervention come in there to make amends? Or are we still going through that process?
Perhaps before I answer your question, I just want to take you back to what you're struggling to see the connection. To some extent, as unpacked by our colleague, the last speaker, I think there are different levels of science diplomacy, from what may seem very simple up to something that's very complex. And for example, if we take multilateral research collaboration, it may look complex, but it's not as complex as if you want to buy a major research infrastructure. For example, a synchrotron. Now, because it costs lots of money, it will be very difficult for you and I to collaborate, and any other person in the US or Europe to collaborate and buy a synchrotron. So there we will need actual political intervention in order to raise the funds to be able to build a synchrotron. And so we will move away from the scientific collaboration that you and I may have with other people to seeking the DG of the European Commission to see if he will agree that they spend some money to assist Africa to buy a synchrotron. So that takes it up to another level, which is actually beyond scientists in that case. It now rests in the hands of financiers, private sector, as well as politicians and public servants. But let me come to what you want, the question you've asked me. Look, I look at it, I'm not sure that will also be clear to you, but I just think, I'm very convinced that there are sometimes societal issues that we can tackle, scientists can tackle, without leaving it all to politicians. And in the case of the transboundary water dispute between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, I feel we are scientists, we should be able to provide evidence-based empirical data to convince politicians that it's not necessary for them to have intentions, because those tensions, at the end of the day, hurt the citizens of all those countries. They don't talk to each other. I know I met two colleagues in China from Ethiopia, and when I wanted to raise this over, the senior person said, no. We are told not to discuss it with anybody. So that was it, and I had to let him, but then when he overheard me discussing with somebody, he then took interest, and I said, we can solve it. You are a scientist, you're not a politician. I'm a scientist, I have no special interest other than, at the end of the day, that there is peace and we have delivered water to all citizens of the three countries without any tensions for war and whatnot.
Right.
And so there I see scientists translating their ability to communicate and their ability to collaborate into what becomes a product which is peaceful coexistence and free use of that natural resource, in this case, the water.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I know we over time, but is there any burning question that you would like to ask the panel?
May I perhaps also
sorry.
provide something? One thought here, because I think, seen now from the scientific side, I think there are two things that drive scientists. The one is the curiosity, is the challenge of the scientific question. But the other one is to make a real impact in the real world with the science. And scientists are not the ones negotiating climate agreements or environmental agreements. That's the task of diplomats. And well, we live in democracies. Policymakers, they can ignore evidence, of course, and I would always hold them to account and ask them, please explain why you are ignoring it. But in an ideal world, of course, when the diplomat is in a negotiation and the other side makes a proposal, then ideally the diplomat is able to turn it to scientists in the second row. What do you think about it? And the scientist runs it through his or her model and then gives a thumb up or thumb down, and then it's of course up to the diplomat to take it on board. Now this is very well developed in some areas, as I mentioned. IPCC, I'm always amazed with the finesse by which IPCC communicates uncertainty and all these issues that really have developed over 30 years now. But it's not the case in other areas. Take free trade agreements. When there are free trade agreements are negotiated, normally the scientists are not in the room. And why do free trade agreements fail? Very often it's about food safety standards, about deforestation in the Amazon, about quite scientific technical questions. And I also, in those areas, I would like the scientific evidence to come to the fore and to be taken into account. Of course, there are other issues, not just science, that will be influencing the decision at the end. But I want the science to be there and the diplomats to be receptive.
Okay, I'm warming up. I come from a country where the scientists have been very, very vocal during the pandemic, but government went ahead and did their policies. They had their governance. Right now, if you go out of this fabulous structure, we're on stage 6 load shedding with the energy crisis. Scientists have been talking for over 20 years. So where's my diplomacy? Yeah. It's nowhere in the room that I'm sitting in when I have to find alternate means to capacitate myself to have energy. I know what you're saying. I'm playing devil's advocate here because I want the colleagues in the room to leave here feeling convinced that there is a space for science diplomacy. And if you just visualize it as the DNA strand, there's science on the one hand, policy and politics, or let's say politics on the other. And we're trying to bring those hydrogen bonds together to bring the language down to the lowest common denominator. And I see a hand there, so just go to the microphone and make your question or comment.
Good afternoon, Dumiso Kimo from the CSIR in Pretoria. Just a quick question, maybe an opinion from Professor Takora. The example you gave seemed to me to embody how science can be brought in to solve intractable transnational problems. You made it a point to write in big, bold, red letters, the proposal was not funded. I wonder, have you thought about what the issue is? Is it that the scientific solution is being deliberately ignored, or is there something else at play, some other dynamic that perhaps we should be looking at to see how this problem can be solved? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. Look, it's a competitive process. And so when I actually did discuss that project at the Inter-Academic Partnerships meeting, and it received an overwhelming support. But when the proposal was not funded, I didn't know why. And I actually didn't ask why. As you know, if your proposal is not funded, you don't ask for reasons. If they are kind enough to give you the critique, you can benefit from that, but nothing came back. There was no feedback that says these are the weaknesses of your proposal. even though, as I said, in a meeting it was strongly supported that we need empirical evidence. We need science-based evidence to show that with the Renaissance Dam, the citizens of the two other countries are going to suffer. We don't have that evidence. There's no basis for it. So scientists have to do that and provide that evidence to disagree or to agree. And that's where we went. So I don't know why it was not funded, but at least I'm glad somebody else or another foundation saw wisdom in it and decided to fund this. And it wasn't a competitive grant. It was just through a conversation. I said, no, that's a brilliant idea. We are willing to support it. Thank you.
Great. There's another question there, one, and one here.
Hello. Sorry. My name is Jason Stum. I'm actually from here in Pretoria, and you'll have to pardon me. I'm graduated from high school a week ago. So I don't have much life experience to really understand, which is why I'd like to pose this question to you. There was some small mention of the private sector, but where is science diplomacy in the business world? When we speak of social justice, we can't ignore the fact that it is the business world which is responsible for some of the most social injustices in this world. And while science, I would wish to be independent, it isn't. Science needs funds, and where is money? It's not in government. Money is in business. So is there diplomacy to reach out to businesses? Is there a way to go directly to the problem and fix it there, rather than trying to go through governmental policies? Because there's so much diplomacy with governmental organizations, academia, but where is the direct solutions? Thank you.
While the panel thinks about that awesome question, I'll ask you to ask your question as well.
Yes. Thank you to the panelists. I have short questions for all of you because all the presentations were quite amazing. For Professor Dakora, my question is, you talked about these regional hubs that your institution is creating across the world. Is it to engage the regional scientists from those areas, or is it also going to be used to engage the African diaspora, like a scientific community? Because Africa is a very large diaspora, there's no database where you can go and Google and know who is where or what skills do they have. So will your hubs help in any way to integrate the African diaspora scientists into all these initiatives? Then for Alexis, I understand that your Tech Diplo Hub actually, through that Barcelona alumni project, you actually created an application which is like a LinkedIn only for the alumni. Can you share a bit or shed a bit of light on that for the benefits of other colleagues like the SDCFA, which is just starting, so that how can they also involve their alumni and that? And for MAGA, my question for you is, you talk of a global science diplomacy curriculum. For it to be global, everyone or every continent has to be involved. So where is Africa's place in this global curriculum? And how are African scientists involved? I know you talked about the Vice Chancellor, but other scientists besides her, where is the place? Then for the coordinator who talked about the supranational diplomacy, it is only happening in Europe. That's where I've seen supranational, not supernatural, but supranational coordination of science diplomacy. What are you doing to transfer the best practices to other continents, for example, to Africa, so that the coordination is not done at a national level, but at a supranational level? And also other continents, I see who are not represented. What are you doing to make sure that they also have similar things? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So let's start from Jan going that way. Your last question.
Well, I'm going to take the one on business, which I think is a very good question. And it's very important to consider the role of the private sector in science diplomacy. And of course, we tend to think always about the big tech companies, and rightly so, because of the influence they have, for instance, through their algorithms, and how they really can, and of course the digital social media, and how they've actually transformed diplomacy itself. You know, nowadays, instead of a not verbal, you exchange a tweet, and create all sorts of conflicts by this. And of course, the standard setting role, of course, also many of these companies have. But it's not just the big ones. There's also a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, which may be world market leaders in their particular small niche. And they, of course, have quite a lot of influence also in the relations between countries. So I think it is very important to engage with them as well, to take them on board, and to create also win-win solutions. For also, if you think of global north and global south, one example I always use is the one of cable cars. 150 years ago in Europe, we invented cable cars to go up mountains and look down from the mountain. And then in South America, they had a problem. They had all these favelas grown on steep hills, no way to get their public transport. And then they had the innovation in South America. Okay, why not use cable cars as a system of urban mass transport, which is something Europeans never have thought of. But guess what? Who's building the cable cars? It's an Austrian company. So
we have one for tourism.
Exactly, and now it's really kind of. But now these processes really start to develop, then also in the global south, triggering this innovation. We've seen the same, of course, now with the vaccines, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. So very important, definitely, to have this dialogue fully also with the private sector.
Yes. Would you like to tackle that last question about the translocation of your EPIC work into other continents?
Well, I mean, that's actually why we are here, engaging with you.
There you go. You
Precisely.
have your answer.
Of course, because, I mean, look, the world is changing so fast.
Yes.
In terms of, you know, the geopolitics, the technology. Nobody has the solutions at hand. We are really going into uncharted territory, where we all can learn from each other. You can learn from us, we can learn from you. You may have come up with a totally different approach to science diplomacy. And of course, also, I mean, Barcelona taking science diplomacy to a local level, that's an innovation. And I think these are really learning experiences where we can learn from each other and basically for the common good of everybody.
Very diplomatic answer. Margot?
Okay, thank you for the question about the private sector, and congratulations on your graduation. Hopefully these topics inspire you in your choice of your college degree. I didn't say it during my presentation so you wouldn't walk out to another session, but in parallel, JESDA is hosting a session on quantum technologies and how to democratize access to quantum. And of course, who will have the quantum computers of the future are the companies who are developing them, IBM, Microsoft. Sitting on the panel is the Vice President for Quantum for Microsoft, Matthias Schroyer. So for JESDA, since the beginning, this has been a no-brainer. It is not only about science and diplomacy in a binary relationship, it is about this multi-stakeholder ecosystem, and obviously the private sector is there. So in all of the solutions and all of these proposals that we make, how to take this technology to the world in an equitable way that benefits everyone, the private sector is from the beginning. So we have basically a methodology of task forces that have a diplomatic and a scientific co-chair, and sometimes three, diplomatic, scientific, and private sector. And those are steering together, bringing together the experts from each community to steer the development of a solution or the pathway towards making, for example, quantum accessible to everyone. And so that's an example. And I think it is now, we are changing a bit of the paradigm of this idea of science, the basic science being done in academia, in universities, in the lab, peer-reviewed, transparent, and open. And we're moving towards deep tech startups, big big tech, but also small deep tech startups that are doing basic science. And that means it's much more difficult to know early on what are they doing, because it's no longer published, it's embargoed, it is under patent. So how do we know what's really happening on the very basic science level when it's now in the hands of the private sector, talking about longevity centers that Jeff Bezos set up in San Diego, talking about neurotechnologies. We already talked about this guy that everybody names are without naming. We talk about the quantum, AI. So we are seeing this transfer of the basic science to the private sector, which makes it a lot more difficult to have this global governance discussion with them, because of course there are some tensions and how do we align the incentives there. And then on the question on the curriculum, obviously every curriculum has to be contextualized to the place of the world, to the issues that are pertinent, right? Because you might have more focus on water issues in one country, and in other countries more focus on health and oceans, whatever. So it is also about this water diplomacy, climate diplomacy that Gianmarco was talking about. You can slice it in all these different ways. So I think we can have perhaps a common understanding of science diplomacy instruments and mechanisms. For example, bringing more scientists into an embassy or science advisors to a foreign ministry. That can be quite general because there are mechanisms that work well to do that. But then when you talk about the issues, you have to contextualize to the political, societal, economic, scientific context of each of the countries. That's why just that the first university in the world that we've partnered is UCT. And so it is really a big focus to work with an horizontal partnership, not to bring a curriculum from somewhere to Africa or to South Africa or to UCT. It is absolutely, it is completely the other way around. So what are what's the context that these instruments and tools can be successful and effective? And then on the question of alumni management, that is very important, and Alexis will say more. But for us, for example, we now work with alumni from the program. Rafaela is sitting there in the embassy of Switzerland in South Africa, but also, for example, scientists from AIMS in Ghana and Rwanda want to implement science diplomacy courses for AIMS, the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, on quantum. And this will be a different curriculum that, a science diplomacy curriculum that is implemented in Brazil or in South America, Latin America, and Alexis also works in there. Maybe you can also talk about how contextualizing the curriculum. So thanks so much for the questions.
Yeah. Part of diplomacy is soundbite technology. You got to deliver your punchy response in a soundbite. Alexis, let's see if you can.
Yeah, 2 minutes just. In the question regarding business, I would say that despite being a fact that our societies could be way more just and fair than they are, the private sector is a key contributor to the advancement of science and technology. And I know this might be an unpopular opinion, but we couldn't understand many of the things we have nowadays without the role of the private sector and the risk that the private sector take. And the vaccines for COVID-19 are an example of a public-private cooperation, and I think that this is something that we should highlight. But if you are interested in this topic beyond how we transfer wealth from business to society and so on, which is, it's more like, would be like national policies, not so much science diplomacy. Jan was mentioning in one of the slides the case of the tech diplomats, countries appointing tech diplomats, and this is a really good example of how diplomats and countries engage with the private sector, in this case big tech corporations, and how they make sure that technology is fair and they don't contribute to creating, I don't know, like fake news or like widening the digital divide and so on. And going back to the question about diasporas and alumni and so on, I think it's obvious that if we acknowledge the role of global talent and diasporas or what we call alumni sometimes, I think that it makes all sense that we use the technological tools we have at our disposal. So it's obvious that having digital platforms where we know who's who, where they're based, what are their knowledge areas, and how this can be a tool for the members of the network themselves, but at the same time for the ecosystem that they have a connection with. So it's a win-win, a bilateral relation. But I mean, happy to share with you more about the digital tools that we employ for this.
Thank you. Felix, any last words?
Yeah, so first and foremost, a number of Africans in the diaspora are also fellows of the African Academy of Sciences. It's open to everyone. In fact, there are many non-Africans who are equally fellows. So those who are fellows, whether they are in Europe or North America, are able to participate in our events, and they are very much aware of what is ongoing. And if I can share this example with you, the U.S. Africa Frontiers of Science Symposium, which took place in October this year. Of the 50 people that came from the US to participate, about 30 of them were actually from the diaspora. And they had been looking for this opportunity for the past 10 to 15 years, and they never had it. So once we had the resources set up to start this symposium series, 30 of them came. The other 20 were from the US who had never been to Africa at all. So the dynamism that you could see taking place at the meeting during the symposium was just spectacular. So they are involved, especially with the current this initiative. They know where to turn to and to get what. And it covers all, well, I shouldn't say all disciplines. I think I did mention artificial intelligence, biodiversity, and whatnot. But going forward, we're going to keep expanding the critical areas where people can participate. So they do know they can contribute to the continent through some of these programs.
Thank you very, very much. Colleagues, I'm sure you will agree with me that my 3 Jacks and a Jill produce a symphony of music because they all spoke with such eloquence, such depth of knowledge, and they brought the complex topic into some format for us to be able to digest. So thank you very, very much for your input. I know I gave you a bit of a hard time, but it was meant to be. And to you, the audience, for being so gracious of staying with us despite us going over time. And last but not least, I want to thank the colleagues from the CSIR, part of the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa, for putting this exotic program for us together. And I am convinced that as the SDCFA grows, that we are going to benefit from your gracious contribution of collaboration and insights. And we wish you all well during the dinner, but also remember, you still have one last responsibility as delegates, and that is to add your voice to the Science for Social Justice declaration that's been sent to you for comment. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of us for being such diligent scholars and engaging on such an exciting topic. And now it's time to party. So, all the best. And thank you also to the technical support. We appreciate you.